Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight to talk about conservation easements. My name's Sarah and I'll be moderating the session tonight. And before we begin, I'd just like to let you know that there will be an opportunity to ask questions later on. So if you have questions as we go along, you can either write them down and save them for the end, or feel free to type them in the chat box as we go along and I will read those out when it's time for questions. Now it's time for me to introduce you to the Georgian Bay Land Trust Executive Director, Bill Lougheed. So Bill has been leading the Georgian Bay Land Trust conservation work for the past 8 years. And during that time, he has worked with Georgian Bay families and other landowners to conserve over 5,500 acres of Georgian Bay wilderness through conservation easement agreements. So he has lots of experience to draw on and will be able to answer a number of your questions tonight. Now I will hand it over to Bill.
Well, thanks all of you for joining us on an evening session here. I will try and get through this fairly quickly. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen here. Bear with me. Okay, can everyone, Sarah, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
So before getting into talking about conservation easements per se, I want to give some rationale behind conservation and behind conservation easements. And really, these conservation tools, certainly as applied on Georgian Bay, these are tools for arresting biodiversity declines through habitat conservation. And many of you will know that the world's biodiversity is not in great shape. And many of you also know that we're on a very special coastline. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background and to help you out with understanding why we're doing this work and why it's important for landowners to consider some of the conservation tools available to them. So just a minute, I need to get this panel out of my way here. Our coastline is the longest freshwater archipelago in the world. It's tenfold bigger than any other archipelago, freshwater archipelago. 5,300 kilometers of land-water interface in our archipelago. There's 5 times at least that land-water interface if you include or 14,700 inland wetlands and rivers and streams. It has the richest, our eastern coast, not all of Georgian Bay, just the eastern coast has the richest biodiversity of reptiles and amphibians in Canada. And it's home to 50 species at risk and many globally rare plants. For that reason and other reasons, it is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and has that designation since 2005. The Georgian Bay Land Trust, for those attending who don't know much about us, we were founded in 1991, so we're in our 30th year. And in that time, we protected over 7,500 acres that provide habitat for 50 Georgian Bay species at risk. We're presently the 3rd largest land trust in Canada in terms of land value. We're in the top 10 in terms of acreage protected of the 140 land trusts across the country. And we do this protection in terms of by doing easements, land donations that are conserved in perpetuity. There's some other conservation vehicles available, such as life interests and things like that, but that's not for tonight's talk. So just a little bit more of the negative, and then I'm going to move on to the positive in terms of what we can do about it. Nature is in its worst shape in human history. That's from the UNESCO 2018 Biodiversity Report. And if you look at this seminal work from Syllabos et al., published in Nature in June 2015, you can see in the black dotted line here, the background species extinction rate since the last extinction 60 million years ago. So that's what we should be tracking out in terms of the number of species we're losing every 100 years or every 1,000 years. And you can see the kick up in all mammals, vertebrates, birds, and other invertebrates. It is, or other vertebrates, it's this upward trend is the same kind of slope that the world had 60 million years ago. So we need to do something about it, and we can. We've lost 1 million species, or 1 million species are threatened in the next 20 years of extinction unless we do something about it. Our birds and mammals, half of the world mammals and a quarter of the birds have had their habitat affected by climate change. That's again due to our actions. We've lost 1 billion of North America's migratory birds since 1970. That's the population decline. And this is due to development and deforestation and all the things we do to induce climate change. If we look more regionally at us here, we see above this line here that 80% of the forests remain in our Georgian Bay biosphere area, 90% of the wetlands remain. We have a lower number of species at risk, 50 species at risk, compared to Southern Ontario, where there are 200 species at risk. And the conservation status of many of our species at risk is good. Below this line in Southern Ontario, this is perhaps foreshadowing what could happen to us, and we have tools to prevent that. But below this line, 70% of forests have been lost, 80% of wetlands are lost, and 200 species at risk, as I previously mentioned. This slide with roads, major roads on it, sort of indicates, you know, it's a surrogate for population density, and it's a surrogate for habitat loss. You know, if you go back to the previous slide, there's a line there. That's sort of where the road density decreases. So in terms of moving forward, there is a simple solution. And E.O. Wilson, the godfather of biodiversity, professor emeritus at Harvard, produced this seminal work. And if you track this curve out to the right, basically what this shows, can everybody see the bottom? I need to move it. This is plotting the percent on the vertical axis, percent of species saved versus percent of habitat preserved. And if we move out to the right on this curve out to here, we see that if we protect 80% of habitats, we're going to protect over 90% of our species from extinction. So this is a generalization across the world. It doesn't necessarily apply to local habitats such as ours, but this is the thought of major scientists about habitat conservation. In terms of the species at risk, we have 21 birds, 13 reptiles, amphibians, 5 mammals, 5 plants, 3 insects, and 3 fish that are listed presently, and that list has grown since I started working on the land trust from 45 to 50. Just a little bit of word about conservation easements and other tools. Connected habitats and wildlife corridors, really, really important. Just one example are 14,700 inland wetlands. If they remain connected, those systems remain resilient to drought, so that if a turtle needs to move from a wetland that is dried up to one close by, if it's cut off by a road or other development, that turtle's going to die. So that's sort of an example of why this connectiveness and the other conservation tools, such as conservation easements, are really important. Also, in terms of corridors, passage equals survival. If our landscape becomes too fragmented, there will be no interconnectedness, and species will not be able to move. And with climate change, in the face of climate change, that poses a real threat to the species on our coast. You know, I'm showing this slide just because it gives you the example of the land-water interface, and this is a huge tract that we saved in 2019 to allow species to move along not only these water connections, but all through the terrestrial connections. This kind of connected habitat is exactly what we need to strive for on our coast. There is Canadian Ecological Gifts Program. It was established over 2 decades ago. It's a wonderful legacy that our federal government has left us. Hopefully it remains in place in future generations and future governments. And it is a tool that rewards, through tax incentives, it rewards people who conserve nature. So in return for conserving natural heritage on a property, the federal government grants income tax credits. These income tax credits carry over to provincial tax credits, certainly in Ontario, because the federal tax is twinned with or coupled to the federal tax. And there is a reduction or elimination of capital gains on either succession when you give your property to your heirs or to your kids. And there's a reduction of property tax on easements in both the township of the Archipelago and the township of Georgian Bay. Those are parts of the zoning bylaws that I had written in my tenure here at the last land trust. So what is a conservation agreement is, in simplified form, a contract between you and the land trust that allows you to set aside part of your property to be protected as undeveloped wilderness while you maintain full ownership and full rights, all property rights and all enjoyments. In return, you're paid or received for placing the agreement on title on your land, and the land is then monitored in perpetuity to make sure you're compliant with the restrictions of the agreement. So a little bit about the restrictions of the agreement. These are normally no buildings. You can create paths, no roads, no commercial fishing, no commercial hunting, usually no hunting. If there's hunting, it will be restricted to, to what Ecological Gifts allows on your property. And that is pretty much it. You're basically going to try and keep your property free from dumping, free from any pollution you cause, and keeping your forests and other habitats, wetlands in good shape. It's really nothing more than that. It's no more. I mean, the number of restrictions on usual easement is the numbers 10 to 15. And they really are minimal. The major ones are no buildings and no vehicles and no roads. So it really is not a very stringent set of restrictions. And those restrictions are developed between discussions with the land trust and the landowner. And we don't go anywhere unless there's that agreement in principle that okay, this is a good thing for both of us to do. So it really is, it's something that's developed by both parties. It's not a top down or one party trying to dictate or control another. It really is an agreement, and that agreement is placed on title, and it can go on title in perpetuity. Our agreements are usually for 999 years. So here's an example of an easement on a property, a hypothetical property where it has a wetland, important wetland back here on this edge. And in red is the area this property owner really only used this for recreational. So this could be, for example, a tennis court or something, or it could, if this was a bigger area, it could have been, his principal residence, a bunkie, and a dock system, and this red line then would go out more here. But this landowner decided, no, I wanted to maximize my benefit here by maximizing the amount of shoreline that I'm protected, because that gets valued high on an easement, and more shoreline over here. So that's what this landowner did. and this landowner actually still has the enjoyment that he wanted from this recreational spot, but the rest of the land is protected, and he received significant tax savings for it. So just reminder, the non-conservation easement portion, you retain all building rights. So this portion in here, anything you're doing now, you can still do. And hypothetically, this landowner could have gifted the remainder of this property, and he eventually did, the family eventually did, but he didn't have to. He could have retained the rights and paid lower taxes on that portion, but he decided to gift it. But the easement itself was valued at 95% in this case of what it would have been valued at as if he gave it to us outright. So that is sort of the ballpark, 90 to 95% valuation on easements versus gifting to a conservancy. And the conservation easement income tax credit value is for an easement as compared to a donation of the land runs around 90 to 95%. So you get almost the same amount of income tax credit with an easement as you do with an outright gift. You to be the landowner, you're in control of your future with an easement, other than 10 restrictions or 15 restrictions on your land. So just a reminder, there are federal and provincial income tax credits. So these come off your income tax payable. So it's not like it's a deduction for a donation you give in the sectors where it would come off of revenue or net revenue. This comes off income tax payable to the government, both the Ontario government and the federal government. You can carry these tax credits forward and use for 10 plus 1 years. So they're in the first, I don't know why they say 10 plus 1 years, but that's the way they phrase it. And so you could use it all up in year 1, you could use it all up in year 11, or you could spread it across 11 years, depending what your income is, in order to maximize the tax credit for you. The capital gains is just comes off your cost base, so that capital gains just remains. So whatever that capital gains credit you got for the valuation of the easement, it just stays in place and it follows you as long as you're owner of the property. It does go away if when you gift it or you sell the property, then that comes off the amount you would pay to the government or have to pay if you're gifting it to your kids. So I am going to go in the next talk into great detail about the tax advantages. I'm just going to do a very cursory review in this one in terms of conservation easements. But the federal tax credit is approximately 30% of the appraised value, and the Ontario tax credit follows that, and it's based on your individual income. So it depends what tax bracket you're on. The capital gains doesn't care about what your income is, of course. And when these tax savings are combined, they can amount to 75% of the sale value if you sold the land. So I'm going to go through an example here where a property is certified for a value of $1 million. This workup's done by Fruit and Kate's LLP of Toronto, and Matt Caloran there is a working colleague of the Land Trust, and he can get into all the nitty-gritty about your personal taxes with respect to easements or donations of land. I want to back up a few slides here. Just take a look at this. A lot of Georgian Bayers, whether they're on the coast or on an inland lake, look nearby properties and they may have bought up an adjacent island that is too small to build on, or they never planned to build on. And so when you're thinking about these conservation tools, you know, the neighboring island that you're never going to build on, if you want to protect it, because, you know, in perpetuity and not be paying taxes going forward, municipal taxes going forward, this is really a great tool to protect those, you know, buffer zones that you created when you bought your bigger property. So I'm just going to go through a scenario here, hypothetical scenario developed by Fruitman Cates of a property worth $1 million, dollars, I should say. And the cost to purchase it was $100,000. So the value of the conservation easement was appraised to be $850,000. And the owner of the property has an annual employment income of $150,000, which is expected to continue for the next 10 years. And the principal residence exemption will not be available for the sale of the property. And this is, of course, this is using 2007 tax rates, but we will be updating that this year. So in this example, this is the sale value, subtracting out $100,000 the cost of the property. The capital gain exposure on the sale is $900,000. Taxable capital gain, 50% of gain is $450,000. So the tax on that is $237,000 if one were to sell it. Mac Cloran has looked at the employment income of this individual at $150,000 over 11 years, and that's what that total is. And tax on employment at the marginal rates, current rate of 2017 would have been for the first year $47,000, and over the next 10 years $477,000. That's a no change. So if we look at this in total, the total tax on employment income and capital gain would be $763,000, and then that after-tax cash realized on is the earnings and the sale would be $1.886 million. So if we look at I'm maybe going to skip on. I'm going to cover this in the next scenario and just do a summary of that, what you just saw. That summary of a sale versus an easement on that property would be the net tax after cash realized if sold would be $1.886 million. Net after tax cash realized with an easement would be 1.546. So the difference between selling this land and putting an easement on it was $339,000. So that is, you know, roughly 75% as if you sold it, but you still own the land. That's the point. So every case is different. I do not give tax advice. Fruitman Cates and organizations that can do you, but I can walk you through the basics of your land and tell you how it can benefit you in broader stroke terms. So the advantages of doing an easement or keeping the cottage in the family by reducing capital gains when passing the property on to your heirs, leaving a legacy of wilderness for your children's children. And I go back to this, easements are in perpetuity. The legacy for biodiversity on our coast is forever. And maybe a little bit of a remark on habitats. We tend to forget that, these shorelines around wetlands, when they get developed, these wetlands get degraded, they get impacted. So when we protect shorelines, we're protecting these coastal wetlands, or inland lakes equally. We're protecting these special places of high biodiversity. We're protecting old growth forests, protecting inland, fens and bogs and swamps. So some of the social and ecological benefits are preservation forever and climate change resilience. Most of us do not know and understand that large tracts of inland forests, the temperature within a large tract of forest is 1 to 2 degrees Celsius cooler than the periphery. Large tracts of forest, they protect some birds that really require those large tracts of large forest tracts. So that's for another talk. I think I'm going to get distracted and go into that too much. So the steps in protecting your wilderness property are to contact me or someone else in the office who will steer them to me or one of my colleagues. We will then do GBLT. We'll do flora and fauna inventory on your property from May to October. That's our window. We use a science-based conservation, natural area conservation plan that we have developed. Original one was Nature Conservancy of Canada one, and we worked with them on that, but now we have our own plan. We have our own mapping for the coast. We go in and we assess the ecological value of your property through a lot of the existing mapping layers as well. We write a case for conservation, a baseline document report. We make all the submissions to the Ecological Gifts Program on your behalf. Then we take it we file with Environment Canada Ecological Gifts Program on your behalf. We do all that work of the applications, and we get the area that you're trying to do an easement on. We get strategically sensitive land by the Government of Canada, and that protects it under statute in perpetuity, or as long as that Act of Parliament remains. The fair market value is then appraised by an AACI appraiser, qualified appraiser. He writes a 90-page report on the value of your easement in this case. And then the government, we submit that to the Government of Canada, and they make a determination if they agree with the assessment of fair market value. And then we issue a tax receipt, and the easement is registered on title in perpetuity. So that is sort of my talk. I don't know how long I ran, but there's a lot of material in here, and I'm happy to take questions on it.
Thanks, Bill. We've got one question coming in here in the chat from Rod, and anyone else, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat or use the raise hand feature, and I can allow you to unmute yourself to ask your question verbally if you prefer that. The first question here, Bill, is can you comment on how hard it is to sell property that has a conservation easement on it?
So properties that where the conservation, where the land is sufficient, if you have a property that is, on I'll speak about the coast. I'm not sure where where your property is, but if you're on the coast of Georgian Bay and you have a property that's larger than 5 acres and you're not inhibiting if you're not inhibiting the rights to build, so if you've not put the easement on shoreline that will restrict what a future owner could do under the present zoning bylaws, and if you're not hindering, the area is not hindering the number of sleeping cabins, for example, you can put on, conservation easements usually increase the value of a property. Why do they increase the value of the property? Because the landowner is knowing that basically this property has buffer to it, and it's never going to be developed. And if it's a larger size property and someone has the money to buy that larger property, they want privacy. They don't want development next to them. An example is an island parcel where it was subdividable, but the owner decided, to put an easement on both parcels, so it protected it from ever being subdividable, and that property value increased. The other example is, putting an easement on an island buffer or on your periphery. These tools are protecting your privacy and future owners' privacy if that offshore island I showed you in that one slide, if that becomes protected, then that increases the value of that property. So long story short, I guess, or short story long, if you don't restrict what you can build on the property by what you do with a conservation tool, you don't diminish the value. And if you do it in the right way, in the smart way, if it's a big enough property, you increase your value.
All right, but we've got a couple questions here about size. So wondering how large a property is worthwhile for the Georgian Bay Land Trust to consider, and are we interested in lots smaller than 5 acres?
Well, sometimes the land trust has been interested in properties smaller than 5 acres, and it really depends on the conservation context, and it depends on the ecological values on the property. If it's a smaller property and it's bordering a provincially significant wetland or some other biodiversity hotspot, it has it's home to spotted turtle or something, that absolutely. So it really depends. It's property specific.
Okay, there's a question here. Property values have increased dramatically over the past year. There's not much for sale right now, and what there is going over asking. Are you adjusting your values based on this market?
The appraiser, we don't adjust the values. It's the AACI certified appraiser that adjusts it, and absolutely the appraisals, these sophisticated appraisals are much different than a 2-pager by a realtor. And they must have many comparables, and they must be real-time comparables. So it shifts, so these appraisals are only good for 6 month window of time. And that's why, that's because the market shifts. And yes, I agree, at the moment the market's going crazy, and therefore appraisal values will be higher.
Okay, there's another question here from Carrie. How is the property treated when passed down in a will?
I need clarification on what's meant by the question.
I think it would be if a property with an easement on it is passed down in a will, what would happen?
Maybe you can unmute her and have her ask the question.
Carrie, yeah, if you'd like to type in a clarification there or unmute yourself, go ahead. In the meantime, there's a question here from Tom. I have a property that has a managed forest designation. If it were donated to the Georgian Bay Land Trust, would the appraised value be reduced due to the tax status?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Marianne's wondering, can you add a condition to the easement within the agreement to include a future dock and connect that to a deck?
Well, shoreline docks are allowed in easements. In fact, we have one easement where docks are permitted, so they are permitted. It just would depend on the context. A dock, a dock in a significant wetland would be a no-no. A dock turn, shoreline without, significant wetland would not be an issue, or fish habitat, or that kind of thing. So yes, docks are permitted. They have been permitted, by other land trusts, and so a dock is not off limits. No.
All right, these are all the questions I see here right now. Is there anyone else who'd like to get a question in before we wrap up here? I don't see any. Did you have any other last words you wanted to add, Bill?
Well, thank you all for attending, and you know, it's a great service if you can spread the word. All of you who attended here, you know that there are these conservation options. We have important shoreline and inland areas to protect, and you can all do your part by to protect biodiversity by spreading the word of what you've heard tonight.
All right, I've just got a clarification here from Carrie about the will question. So it's if the property had an easement on it entirely or on nearly all of it, are the capital gains waived for the family to whom it was willed?
Well, yes. I mean, most of the capital gains would definitely be gone. Yes.
Okay, and there's one more question about a recording. So we are recording this, and I believe we will send it out to the participants tomorrow by email. So that's all our questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And just a reminder that, as Bill mentioned, he will be doing a follow-up presentation on August 12th. That's another Thursday at 7 p.m. To go into more details about the tax situation. So a link to sign up for that will be sent around by email to all of you again tomorrow with the recording. So if you're interested in hearing more about tax details, please join us on August 12th. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you all.